The door of the rail car opened on a night when the wind carried 14 voices through the snow. 14 people stood outside, their faces blue-white in the lantern light, their children pressed against their legs like small animals seeking warmth. Among them stood the very man who had told Marjorie Colton she would die in this place. He was on his knees now. But we will come back to that. Because the strangest thing about that night was not the storm. It was the tin box hidden beneath the floorboards, and the name inside it that would change everything she thought she knew about the rail car, about the inspector who had tried to take it from her, and about a woman who had died in the cold 13 years before. But that revelation was still 7 weeks away. 7 weeks earlier, on a November evening in 1884, the temperature in Laramie, Wyoming territory dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that does not simply surround you. It enters you. It finds the gaps in your clothing, the thin places in your skin, the warm blood moving just beneath the surface, and it begins to take what belongs to you. Your fingers first, then your ears, then your thoughts. Marjorie Colton stood in the yard of the house she had kept for 6 years. Her 8-year-old son, Elias, pressed against her hip. Neither of them wore coats heavy enough for this. Neither of them carried food or money or anything at all beyond the clothes they had been wearing when Rudolph found the letter 2 hours before. The letter had been nothing. A note from the school teacher complimenting Elias on his arithmetic. A polite inquiry about whether the boy might benefit from additional reading materials. Signed with professional courtesy, sealed with professional distance. There was nothing in it that any reasonable person would question. But Rudolph Colton had not been reasonable in a very long time. The mine had cut his hours in September. He had been drinking since October. By November, he saw betrayal in every shadow, conspiracy in every kindness directed toward his wife. The schoolteacher's letter became proof of adultery. The neat handwriting became evidence of a secret life. The polite tone became mockery of a man who could barely sign his own name. He had grabbed Marjorie by the arm hard enough to leave bruises that would darken for days. He had thrown Elias's thin coat after them into the yard. And then he had said the words that Marjorie would carry with her through everything that followed. No son of mine needs a woman's teaching. Take him. You made him weak. The door slammed. The bolt shot home. And Marjorie Colton stood in 20 below zero with an 8-year-old boy and nothing else in the world. "Mama, I am cold." His voice was so small against the silence of that frozen night. His breath made white clouds that hung in the air before disappearing. His lips were already losing their color, going from pink to pale to something that frightened her. "I know, sweetheart. We are going to find somewhere warm. I promise." She looked back at the house one final time. Her house. The windows she had cleaned. The meals she had cooked. The floors she had scrubbed on hands and knees, while Rudolph sat and drank and found fault with everything her hands had built. The lamplight glowed warm and golden behind the glass, and Rudolph's silhouette stood watching from inside to make certain they left. They walked. Every step took them further from warmth and closer to something Marjorie could not yet name. She calculated as she moved. No money. Rudolph controlled every cent. No family within 300 miles. Her father dead 11 years now, her mother before that. Her brother somewhere in California, lost to distance and silence. The boarding house would want payment. The church might offer one night, but Reverend Whitley had never approved of her. "Too educated for a miner's wife," he had said once. "Too proud." And there was something worse than cold. Rudolph had spent the afternoon in the saloon before coming home. He had told his version first. By the time Marjorie walked through town, the story had already hardened into fact. The unfaithful wife, the scheming woman, the mother who had shamed her husband and deserved what she got. She could see it in the windows. Curtains moved as she passed. A door opened and closed quickly, as if someone had thought about helping and then thought better of it. Ida Crenshaw stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with the satisfied expression of a woman who collected other people's misfortunes like pressed flowers. At the edge of town, where the last buildings gave way to open prairie and the tracks of the Union Pacific stretched east and west into darkness, Marjorie stopped. The railroad yard. She had passed it 1,000 times without truly seeing it. But tonight, with Elias's hand growing colder in hers and the town sealed shut behind them, she saw everything. The abandoned equipment, the forgotten sidings, the shapes of old freight cars sitting on rusted tracks, dark and silent as sleeping animals. "Come with me," she said. "I have an idea." The railcar sat alone on a spur of track that had not been used in years. Weeds grew through the gravel around its wheels, brown and dead in winter, but proof that nothing had moved here in a long time. The paint had faded from Union Pacific red to a dull rust that blended with the oxidized iron beneath. One end sat slightly higher where the track had settled unevenly, giving the whole car a tired, tilted look, like something the world had simply forgotten about. The sliding door resisted. Frozen rust held it in place. Marjorie threw her weight against it, and the metal screamed, a sound that cut through the silent yard like a cry. 6 inches, a foot, enough to slip through. Inside, darkness. The smell of old wood and iron and years of emptiness. But it was dry. Completely dry. No snow on the floor, no water stains on the ceiling. The wooden planks beneath her feet were solid. She brought Elias in. He stood close to her, shivering, his breath visible even inside the car. The space was roughly 30 feet long and 8 feet wide, larger than many homestead cabins she had known. In the corner, something reflected the faint starlight coming through gaps in the walls. Marjorie knelt and found a small tin box wedged between 2 floorboards, rusted around the edges but intact. She pried it open with stiff fingers. Inside, a few coins, a spool of thread, and a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. The handwriting was careful, precise, the hand of someone educated. Someone who had chosen each word deliberately. If you are reading this, perhaps you have nowhere else to go either. This railcar kept me alive. Me. It can keep you alive too. You are stronger than you know. Signed, E.M. 1871. Marjorie read it twice. Someone had been here before. Someone had faced this same darkness, this same cold, the same abandonment, and that someone had survived long enough to leave these words behind. She folded the note and placed it back in the tin. Then she looked at Elias, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a question he was afraid to ask. "What did you find, Mama?" A message. From someone who lived here before us. He was quiet for a moment. his 8-year-old mind turning the idea over carefully. Did they make it? Are they okay? Marjorie thought about the note, about the hope pressed into those yellowed words by a stranger 13 years gone. I believe they did, sweetheart. Then Elias asked the question that would define everything that came after. Can we really live here? Marjorie looked around the railcar, at the gaps in the walls that let in the cold, at the empty space that held nothing but shadows, at the door that would not close all the way. And she heard her father's voice, dead these 11 years, as clearly as if he were standing beside her, his Cornish accent, his calloused hands gesturing as he explained how the miners in Redruth kept warm 1,000 feet underground. Stonehold's heat, Marjorie girl. The earth never lies. You learn to listen to what it tells you, and it will keep you alive. Yes, she said to her son, this is our home now, and I am going to make it warm. She pulled him close. Bramble of wind found its way through the wall gaps and stirred her hair. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. Inside, a woman with nothing held her son and made a promise she had no way of keeping, but she would keep it anyway. They did not eat for 3 days. Marjorie told Elias she had found bread in her coat pocket that first morning. She told him she had eaten while he slept. She told him the tightness in her face was just the cold, not hunger, and that the trembling in her hands was from the work she had been doing, not from a body beginning to consume itself. She lied to him the way mothers have always lied to their children, with love, with precision, with the understanding that an 8-year-old boy cannot carry the weight of knowing his mother is starving. Elias ate the last stale roll she had found in her deepest pocket on the second night. He chewed it slowly, making it last, and offered her half without being asked. She told him she had already eaten and watched him finish every crumb. His eyes said he did not believe her. But he was 8 and hungry, and the bread was warm from being pressed against his body all day. By the third morning, Marjorie's vision blurred when she stood up too fast. Her fingers shook when she tried to grip things. The cold had become something more than temperature. It had become a companion, a presence that sat beside her and whispered that this was foolish, that she should take Elias back to Rudolph, that a warm house with a violent man was better than a frozen railcar with a good mother. She had 3 matches. She had found them in the lining of her coat pocket weeks ago, tucked there from some errand she could not remember. 3 matches between her son and the killing cold. The first match broke when she struck it. The sulfur had crumbled away from the wooden stem, and Marjorie stared at the useless stick in her fingers and felt something close to panic. 2 matches. The second match flared, burned bright for 3 seconds, and then the wind from the gap in the door found it and snuffed it out before she could touch it to the newspaper she had crumpled beneath her small pile of wood scraps. 1 match. Marjorie sat very still. Elias watched her from the sleeping corner, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they had found. Bramble, the dog they had not yet met, was still 3 days away from entering their lives. There was no warmth in the railcar except what their bodies produced, and their bodies were producing less and less. 1 match. 1 chance. And then her father's hands were in front of her again. Not his face, not his voice this time, but his hands. The way they had moved in the mine workshop behind their house in Cornwall when she was 9 years old. The way he had struck flint against steel, angling the sparks downward into a nest of dry tinder. The way he had cupped his palms around the tiny ember and breathed life into it with the gentleness of a man coaxing a newborn to take its first breath. You do not need matches in a mine, Marjorie. Girl, matches run out. But the earth gives you flint, and steel is in your pocket. The earth never lies. She did not have flint, but she had the railroad yard. She had seen stones along the track bed, pale gray stones with sharp edges that looked like the chert her father had used. She left Elias with instructions not to move and walked out into the frozen morning, her body stiff with hunger and cold, her eyes scanning the ground with the focus of someone whose child's life depended on what she found in the next 10 minutes. 7 minutes later, she returned with 2 pieces of chert and a steel bolt she had pried from a rotted railroad tie. She struck them together over the newspaper nest. Once, twice, 12 times. Her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly control the angle. Sparks flew, tiny orange stars that landed on the paper and died. On the 15th strike, a spark caught. A tiny glow, no bigger than a freckle, appeared on the edge of the crumpled newspaper. Marjorie bent low and breathed on it the way her father had taught her, slowly, steadily, not too hard, not too soft, feeding oxygen to the ember without overwhelming it. The glow spread, the paper darkened around it. A thin thread of smoke rose, and then flame, small, fragile, trembling like a living thing, but flame, real fire. Marjorie fed it wood scraps, then larger pieces, then chunks of coal she had gathered from the track bed where they had fallen from freight cars. The stones she had collected from the creek bed began to absorb heat and radiate it back into the space. The railcar warmed. Not much. Not enough. But the air around the fire pit stopped trying to kill them, and that was enough for now. It works, Elias whispered. Mama, you made it work. We made it work, sweetheart. All of us. There were only 2 of them, but Marjorie said all of us because she was counting her father. She was counting the dead man's hands that had guided hers across 11 years and 3,000 miles of distance. The skills you need are already inside you. You just have to remember who taught them to you. On the 4th morning, while clearing debris from beneath the sleeping platform she was building, Marjorie's fingers found something wedged between the floorboards near the back wall. A roll of paper, tightly wound and tucked into a gap where 2 planks did not quite meet. She unrolled it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed, but the drawings on it were precise, detailed, the work of someone who understood engineering, diagrams of the rail car, cross-sections showing wall construction, annotations in small, careful handwriting indicating where to stuff insulation material, how to angle a fire pit for maximum heat retention, where to cut ventilation gaps to draw smoke out without losing warmth. Measurements in feet and inches, notes about wind direction and snow load. The handwriting matched the note in the tin box. EM, whoever that was, had not just survived in this rail car. EM had studied it, had understood it the way an engineer understands a structure, the way a miner understands a tunnel, and the terminology in the annotations. Marjorie's breath caught when she read them. Stope ventilation, cross-cut drainage, load-bearing wall. These were mining terms. Cornish mining terms. The same language her father had used in his workshop. The same words she had absorbed without knowing she was learning. EM had been a miner's daughter, or a miner's wife. Someone from the same world Marjorie had come from. Someone who had carried the same knowledge across an ocean and applied it to survival in a place just like this one. She rolled the diagrams carefully and placed them with the tin box. Then she began following the instructions, adjusting her insulation work to match EM's designs. "Whoever you were," Marjorie whispered, "thank you." The town dump lay a mile from the railroad yard. Marjorie approached it like her father had approached a new mine seam, with calculation, with the understanding that what others discarded might be exactly what she needed. They made multiple trips that first week. Marjorie carried the heavy things. Elias carried what his small arms could manage: burlap sacking for wall insulation, newspapers for kindling and additional insulation layers, a bent iron pot with a hole in the bottom, scraps of wool fabric, moth-eaten but usable, rope frayed at one end, nails scattered in the ash. Elias proved gifted at finding small treasures. His eyes were sharp, his fingers quick. He crawled into spaces Marjorie could not reach and emerged with handfuls of bent nails, a half-burned candle, a tin cup with a dented side, buttons, wire. And then he held up a piece of slate. One corner broken off, but the rest smooth and usable. He looked at his mother with an expression that broke something open inside her chest. "For my lessons, Mama, so I do not fall behind." Marjorie turned away, he would not see her face. In the midst of survival, in the middle of hunger and cold and the slow grinding work of staying alive, her 8-year-old son was thinking about his education, about the future, about becoming something more than what the world was trying to make him. "That is wonderful, Elias. We will make sure you do not fall behind. We will make sure of that." The insulation work consumed the first week. Marjorie stuffed burlap into the wall gaps following EM's diagrams, packing it loose to trap air, then covering it with layers of newspaper. She positioned the fire pit according to the drawings, placing the flat stones she had carried from the creek bed on a piece of sheet metal that old Josiah Keel had helped her find. Josiah arrived on the 5th day. He was 75 years old, white-bearded, leaning on a walking stick carved from a railroad tie. He had worked for the Union Pacific for 40 years before his body gave out. Now he lived in a shack at the edge of town on a pension that barely kept him alive. He stood outside the rail car watching Marjorie work for 10 minutes before he spoke. "You are doing it wrong." Marjorie turned, ready for another attack. But Josiah's face held no judgment, just observation. "The burlap. You are packing it too tight against the east wall. Wind comes from the northwest here. East wall needs less insulation, more ventilation. Otherwise, you will get condensation, and condensation will freeze, and frozen moisture will crack your boards by February." Marjorie stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I spent 30 years sleeping in railcar dormitories while we laid track across this territory. You learn things when your life depends on them." He paused. "Your fire pit is good. Stone placement is solid. But you need to raise it another 2 inches on the windward side. Heat will distribute more evenly." He showed her. His old hands, gnarled and spotted with age, moved with the confidence of someone who had done this work 1,000 times. He adjusted the stone placement. He showed her how to angle the ventilation gap to create a draft that pulled smoke out without pulling heat with it. "Why are you helping me?" Marjorie asked. Josiah was quiet for a moment. "Because I was alone once too, and because I do not like watching good people suffer while bad people sleep warm." He turned to go, then stopped. "I have tools I do not use anymore. I will bring them by tomorrow. And Mrs. Colton, you are going to make it. I have seen that look in your eyes before. What look? The look of someone who refuses to die. Ida Crenshaw arrived the next morning. She stood 20 feet from the rail car with her arms crossed and her chin lifted at the angle of someone delivering a verdict. Well, look at this. Colton's Folly. That is what they are calling it in town. A woman playing house in a rusted tin can. Ida's voice carried in the way gossip always carries, sharp and far. I told Reverend Whitley. I told everyone. This is what happens when a woman gets above herself. This is what pride looks like when it has nowhere left to go. Marjorie said nothing. She continued stuffing burlap into the wall gap she was working on. You know, Ida continued, if you had been a proper wife, kept your eyes where they belonged, instead of passing notes with school teachers, you would still have a roof over your head. A real roof. Not this. Mama. Elias had appeared in the doorway. His small face was flushed. She is lying. She is lying about you. Marjorie put a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Crenshaw. We will manage. Ida made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Manage. She turned and walked away, already composing the story she would tell at the general store, at the church, at every kitchen table where women gathered to discuss the failings of other women. When she was gone, Elias looked up. Why did you not tell her the truth? Why did you not tell her Papa was wrong? Marjorie knelt to his level. Because some people do not want the truth, sweetheart. They want a story that makes them feel better about their own lives. And nothing I say will change that. But it is not fair. No, it is not fair. But we cannot control what other people think. We can only control what we build. And what we build will speak for itself. 3 days later, Jasper Foley and 2 of his friends appeared at the edge of the railroad yard. They were young, maybe 20, with the loose confidence of men who had never been truly tested by anything. They stood watching the rail car and passing a bottle between them. I give her 2 more weeks, Jasper said loudly enough for Marjorie to hear. January at the outside. Who wants in? 5 cents says she crawls back to Rudolph before Christmas. His friends laughed. One of them threw a snowball that hit the railcar wall with a flat, wet sound. Bramble, who had not yet arrived, was not there to growl at them. Elias was inside. Marjorie was on the roof, checking for gaps, and she heard every word. She said nothing. She continued working. But she remembered the bet, and she remembered the laughter, and she filed both away in the place inside her where fuel was stored for the fire that kept her moving. On the 8th day, Elias found the dog. He had wandered to the edge of the dump, searching for nails, when Marjorie heard him call out with a sound she had not heard from him since before Rudolph threw them out. Excitement. Mama, come look. Come look. A small head emerged from a pile of old canvas and rotting wood. A dog, young, maybe 2 years old, with matted golden fur and one ear that had been torn and healed crooked. The animal was thin, ribs showing through the dirty coat, but its eyes were bright, watchful, and when it looked at Elias, something passed between them that Marjorie recognized. The look of 2 abandoned creatures finding each other. He is alone, Mama. Like us. We cannot take care of a dog, Elias. We can barely take care of ourselves. But Elias had already extended his hand, slowly. the way Marjorie had taught him. The dog sniffed his fingers, licked them. A matted tail began to wag, hesitant, as if wagging was something it had forgotten how to do. "Please, Mama. He needs us." Marjorie looked at the dog, at her son's face, lit up for the first time since that night in the yard, at the animal pressing itself against Elias's legs, like it had been waiting for exactly this boy to find it. "If he becomes a burden," she started, but Elias was already wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, and the dog was leaning into him with a sound that was almost a sigh, and Marjorie understood that this decision had already been made. "I will call him Bramble, because we found him in the brambles. Bramble it is." The dog slept between them that night, his body warm against their legs, and for the first time since Rudolph threw them out, Marjorie slept deeply enough to dream. Bramble appointed himself guardian of the railcar from that first night forward. He lay near the door with his head on his paws, ears moving at every sound, and when strangers approached, a low growl rose from his chest that was far deeper than his size should have produced. He was not large, but he was fierce in the way that only creatures who have known abandonment can be fierce. He had found his people, and he would not lose them again. Mrs. Helga Lindgren appeared at the kitchen door of the Grand Hotel on the 9th evening. Marjorie had come to the back entrance, driven there by hunger she could no longer hide, her pride reduced to something smaller than the need to feed her child. Helga was a Swedish woman in her 50s, wide-shouldered and calm-eyed, who had come to Wyoming with her husband during the railroad years. Her husband had died in a tunnel collapse 11 years ago, but Helga had stayed. Her cooking had made her indispensable to the hotel, and her silence had made her safe. She was a woman who kept her opinions behind her teeth. She looked at Marjorie. She looked at Elias standing behind his mother. She looked at Bramble sitting at the boy's feet. She said nothing for 5 seconds that felt much longer. Then she disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a pot of lamb stew that she claimed had scorched on the bottom, not fit for guests, and a bag of bread rolls that had gone stale, unsuitable for the dining room. The stew was perfect. The bread was soft. "Tomorrow," Helga said quietly, "same time. I will have more food that is not good enough for guests." Marjorie understood the fiction. She accepted her role in it. "Thank you," she whispered. Helga nodded once and closed the door. From that day forward, Helga burned food with remarkable regularity. The real crisis came 3 weeks into December. 2 threats arrived on the same day, like wolves circling the same wounded animal from different directions. Ambrose Dillon, the railroad inspector, appeared first. He was a tall man with a thin mustache and the particular authority of someone who had spent decades enforcing rules on behalf of people more powerful than himself. He approached the rail car with 2 men behind him. "This is railroad property. You are trespassing on Union Pacific land. You have 48 hours to vacate, or I will have you arrested." Marjorie had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed responses, but facing it was different from imagining it. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. Your situation is not my concern. 48 hours. Dillon paused. "Of course, the railroad sometimes rents abandoned equipment. $3 a week would secure your tenancy legally. $3 a week. More than Marjorie could earn in a month. I do not have $3 a week. Then I suggest you find it." He walked away, and the ground beneath Marjorie's careful survival shifted. Rudolph came that same afternoon, sober, which was worse. Drunk Rudolph was a storm, Sober Rudolph was a knife. Here is how this works, Marjorie. You come home. You apologize to me in front of the whole town. You admit the letter was what I said it was. Or I take Elias, and you never see him again. Judge Harrison is a friend. No court in Wyoming gives custody to a woman living in a railcar. The words hit her like stones. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. The law was not on her side. The town was not on her side. A judge would look at Rudolph in his warm house and Marjorie in her rusted rail car, and the decision would take less than a minute. Come home and be a wife, or lose your son. He walked away, confident, satisfied. Marjorie stood in the frozen yard and felt the world tilt. That night was the closest Marjorie came to breaking. Elias slept on the platform she had built, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they owned. Bramble curled against his back. The fire had burned low. The cold was creeping back in through the walls, finding every gap she had not yet sealed, every weakness in the armor she had built around their lives. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and did the math. If she went back, Elias would be warm. He would have food. He would sleep in a bed. The price would be bruises. The price would be silence. The price would be teaching her son that a woman's place was on her knees before a man who used his fists to settle arguments. If she stayed, she might lose him entirely. A judge. A courtroom. A man in a warm house against a woman in a rail car. The math was simple, and it was devastating. She stood up. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the cold metal and pushed it open 2 inches. The night air hit her face like a blade. The town was out there. Rudolph's house was out there. Warm, lit, waiting. All she had to do was walk. She pushed the door open another inch. The wind found the gap and swirled into the rail car, stirring the embers, making Bramble lift his head. The dog looked at her. His eyes caught the faint orange glow of the dying fire, and in them, Marjorie saw something that might have been a question. From the sleeping platform, Elias murmured in his sleep. His voice was thick with dreams, barely audible above the wind. But the words were clear. The earth never lies, Grandpa. The earth never lies. Marjorie's hand stopped on the door. Her father's phrase, the word she had taught Elias when he was 5, sitting on her lap while she told him stories about the grandfather he would never meet. The Cornish miner who had taught her that stone holds heat, that flint makes fire, that the earth will tell you everything you need to know if you learn to listen. She had forgotten that she had given those words to her son. She had forgotten that the knowledge did not belong to her alone anymore. It belonged to Elias now. It was his inheritance, the only inheritance she could give him. And if she walked back to Rudolph's house, she would be teaching him that the inheritance was worth nothing, that everything her father had built, everything he had passed down, everything that had kept them alive in this rail car, meant less than a warm room in a violent man's house. She closed the door. She sat down. She cried. For the first time since Rudolph had thrown them out, Marjorie Colton cried. Not the careful, hidden tears of a woman trying to be strong, but the deep, shaking sobs of a woman who had just looked at the worst version of herself and turned away from it. Bramble left his spot by Elias and came to her. He pressed his body against her side and put his head in her lap, and she buried her fingers in his fur and cried until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face. She opened EM's diagrams by the light of the last embers, and she began to plan. Help came from unexpected directions. Whitfield Crane was 70 years old with wild white hair and a suit that had been elegant 2 decades ago. His office was buried in paper and conviction. He had spent his career taking cases other lawyers refused, cases involving women who had been thrown away by the legal system designed to protect the men who hurt them. "Tell me everything," he said. Marjorie told him. The letter, Rudolph's accusations, the bruises she had hidden for 6 years, the drinking, the control, the night he threw them out, the custody threat. Crane listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The law is not kind to women in your position, but there are exceptions. If we can demonstrate that Mr. Colton is unfit, evidence of drinking, violence, instability, it will not be easy. It will not be quick, but it might be possible." He opened a filing cabinet. "I need you to document everything, every bruise, every threat, every witness who has seen his behavior. And Marjorie, there is something else. The railroad inspector, Ambrose Dillon. He has a history the railroad would prefer to stay buried. Give me time. Let me see what I can find." Hugh McAllister came to repair the door hinge on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week. He was 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the quiet manner of a man who had learned that words were less reliable than work. He was a blacksmith by trade, Scottish by birth, and a widower of 3 years. His wife had died of pneumonia, and something in him had gone quiet after that. Not broken, just waiting. He had heard about the railcar. Everyone had heard about the railcar, but where others saw scandal or comedy, Hugh saw something that made him put down his hammer, close his forge early, and walk to the railroad yard with a box of tools and a door hinge he had made that morning. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared, examined the broken hinge, removed it, and began fitting the new one. Marjorie watched him work for several minutes before speaking. "I did not ask for help." "I know," Hugh said without looking up. "I cannot pay you." "I know." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her then. His eyes were steady and unhurried. "Because a door that does not close properly will kill you faster than the cold. And because I had a spare hinge." He finished the work, tested the door. It closed fully for the first time since Marjorie had forced it open on that first night. The wind that had been a constant presence in the rail car stopped. The temperature inside rose noticeably within an hour. He came back 2 days later with a bucket of coal from his forge. Then 3 days after that with a piece of iron he had shaped into a grate for her fire pit. Then again with a set of hooks for hanging pots over the flames. Each visit had a reason. Each reason was practical. Each visit lasted slightly longer than the one before. Elias noticed first. "Mr. McAllister comes here a lot, Mama. He is helping us, Elias. He smiles when he sees you. He does not smile at other people. I have watched." Marjorie felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire pit. "Eat your dinner, Elias." Bramble's tail wagged every time Hugh's boots sounded on the gravel outside. The dog had made his judgment and found Hugh acceptable. Marjorie trusted the dog's judgment more than she trusted her own. By the 5th week, the railcar had become something no one in Laramie expected. Home. The walls were insulated and sealed. The fire pit radiated heat that the metal walls held and reflected back into the space. The door closed properly. A sleeping platform raised off the floor held their bedding. Shelves made from salvaged crates lined one wall, each item in its place. The cracked mirror hung beside the door, catching lamplight and doubling it. Curtains made from flour sacks covered the gaps that served as windows. Elias did his lessons on the slate each evening by firelight. Bramble lay at his feet, sighing contentedly, his torn ear twitching at sounds from outside. Marjorie sewed by lamplight, mending clothes for the few people in town who cared more about quality work than scandal. One evening, Elias looked up from his slate. "Mama, are we poor?" Marjorie set down her needle. She looked around the rail car, at the fire dancing in its stone circle, at the walls they had sealed with their own hands, at the dog sleeping at her son's feet, at the mirror that made the lamplight feel like abundance. "No, sweetheart, we are not poor. We are rich in what matters." He considered this with the gravity that only 8-year-old philosophers possess. Then he nodded and returned to his letters, accepting his mother's definition of wealth. But what Marjorie did not know, as she sat in the warmth she had built from nothing, was that Whitfield Crane had spent the afternoon in the county records office, and what he had found in the railroad archives would change everything she understood about the rail car, about EM, and about the man who had threatened to throw her out of the only home she had left. That discovery was still 3 days away, and when it came, nothing would be the same. Hugh McAllister stopped coming on a Wednesday. No explanation, no message sent through Josiah or Helga or anyone else. He simply did not appear at the time he had been appearing for the past 2 weeks. And the railcar felt his absence the way a room feels the absence of a fire that has been quietly burning in the corner. Elias noticed before Marjorie would allow herself to. "Where is Mr. McAllister, Mama?" "He is busy, sweetheart. He has his own work." But Marjorie walked to town the next morning on the pretense of collecting mending, and she passed the blacksmith forge, and what she saw through the open door made her stop. Hugh was inside, working the bellows, his face lit orange, by the coals, and standing across from him, leaning against the anvil with the casual menace of a man who owns every room he enters, was Rudolph. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture. Rudolph's finger pointing at Hugh's chest. Hugh's jaw set, his eyes down, the bellows moving mechanically in his hands. Rudolph leaning closer, saying something that made Hugh's knuckles go white around the bellows handle. Then Rudolph straightened, smiled the way a man smiles when he has won something, and walked out through the back door without seeing Marjorie standing in the street. Hugh did not look up. He did not come to the rail car that afternoon, or the next day, or the day after that. On the 4th day, Marjorie understood. Rudolph had threatened him. The forge, his livelihood, maybe his safety. And Hugh had made the calculation that every person makes when violence enters the equation. The calculation that says, "I cannot afford to be involved." She did not blame him. She wanted to, because blame would have been easier than the hollowness that settled into her chest. But she had lived with a violent man for 6 years, and she knew what that violence could do to the people standing near it. It bent them. It rearranged their courage into something smaller and more practical. It made cowards of good people, not because they lacked bravery, but because bravery had a cost they could not pay. So Hugh stayed away, and Marjorie added his absence to the inventory of things she carried. Ida Crenshaw made sure the town heard about Hugh's visits before they stopped. The gossip woman had been watching, of course. She had always been watching. And the story she assembled from her observations was exactly the story Rudolph had already planted. First the schoolteacher, now the blacksmith. Ida told anyone who would listen, and in a town of 30 houses, everyone would listen. That woman collects men the way other women collect recipes. No wonder Rudolph threw her out. Reverend Marcus Whitley incorporated the sentiment into his Sunday sermon without naming Marjorie directly. He spoke about the dangers of wayward women, about the temptations that led good families astray, about the importance of modesty and submission in the eyes of God. Everyone in the congregation knew exactly who he meant. Some of them turned to look at the empty pew where Marjorie used to sit. The mending work dried up. The two women who had been bringing Marjorie their clothes stopped coming. The shopkeeper who had quietly traded goods for her sewing closed his door when he saw her approaching. The fiction of Mrs. Lindgren's burned food continued, but even Helga seemed more cautious now, pressing the pots into Marjorie's hands quickly and closing the kitchen door faster than before. The town was tightening around her. She could feel it the way animals feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Something was contracting, squeezing the small spaces where she had found room to survive. Elias asked about Hugh again on the 6th day of his absence. Marjorie told him the same lie. He is busy, sweetheart. But her son's eyes had grown older in the weeks since Rudolph threw them out, and the look he gave her said he recognized the lie for what it was, and that he was choosing to let her have it because he loved her. That look hurt worse than anything Rudolph had ever done. Whitfield Crane arrived at the Railcar on a gray afternoon when the sky looked like a bruise that had not yet darkened. He was carrying his leather satchel and walking faster than a 70-year-old man should walk in December. "Marjorie," he said, "sit down. I have found something." She sat on the edge of the sleeping platform. Elias was outside with Bramble, throwing sticks for the dog to chase along the track bed. Through the gap that served as a window, she could see them, boy and dog, moving through the gray landscape like two small flames against the cold. Crane opened his satchel and removed a folder thick with yellow documents. "The woman who wrote the note in your tin box. E.M., I have found her." Marjorie's breath caught. Who was she? Her name was Edith Morrow. Crane placed a document on the sleeping platform between them. "This is her death certificate. Filed March 14th, 1871. Cause of death, exposure. She was found on the road between Laramie and Rock Springs, frozen. She had been dead at least 3 days when a mail carrier discovered her body." Marjorie touched the edge of the document. The paper was brittle. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the name was legible. Edith Charlotte Morrow. Age 34. Country of origin, England. She lived in the Railcar, Marjorie said. She wrote the note. She made the diagrams. Crane nodded. She arrived in Laramie in the autumn of 1870. Her husband, a Cornish miner named Thomas Morrow, had died in a shaft collapse at the Centennial Mine 6 months earlier. She had no money, no family in the territory, and no prospects. She found the rail car the same way you did, by desperation. And she survived the winter of 1870 in exactly the way you are surviving this one, using the same knowledge, the same techniques. Marjorie, Edith Morrow, was from Redruth. Marjorie stared at him. Redruth, the mining town in Cornwall where her own father had been born, where he had learned the techniques he had taught her, where generations of miners and their families had developed the knowledge of stone and heat and insulation that had kept Marjorie and Elias alive. She was Cornish, Marjorie whispered. Like my father, like your father. The diagrams in the rail car, the mining terminology, the insulation techniques, all of it came from the same tradition your father carried to America. Two women from the same corner of the world, separated by 13 years, surviving in the same rail car with the same knowledge. Marjorie sat with this for a long moment. The weight of it. The strange, looping nature of history. Edith had stood where Marjorie stood, had felt the same cold, the same fear, the same determination, had used the same words, stope ventilation, cross-cut drainage. The earth never lies. How did she die? Marjorie asked, though she already felt the shape of the answer forming. Crane's face changed. This is where it gets difficult. He pulled another document from the satchel. In February 1871, a railroad inspector filed a report declaring the rail car an unauthorized habitation and ordering its occupant removed. The inspector personally oversaw the removal. Edith was given 24 hours to vacate. She left with nothing in the middle of winter, and she died on the road 3 days later. Marjorie's hands went cold. The railroad inspector. Crane met her eyes. The inspector who removed Edith Morrow from this rail car in 1871 was a man of 42, already 15 years into a career of following orders without questioning them. His name is in the report. Ambrose Dillon. His name is in the report. Ambrose Dillon. The world went very quiet. Ambrose Dillon. The same man who had stood outside this rail car 3 weeks ago and given Marjorie 48 hours to leave. The same man who had demanded $3 a week he knew she could not pay. The same man who had looked at her with the satisfaction of a bureaucrat exercising power over someone who had none. He had done it before. 13 years ago, he had thrown a woman out of this exact rail car, and she had died for it, and now he was trying to do it again. Edith's family tried to sue the railroad, Crane continued, but Dillon made the evidence disappear. He altered his report. He claimed Edith had left voluntarily. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. But records have a way of surviving, Marjorie. They hide in filing cabinets and county archives and the memories of clerks who keep copies of everything. I have the original report. I have the death certificate. I have a letter from the mail carrier who found her body describing the direction she had come from and the state she was in. Dillon killed Edith Morrow as surely as if he had put a gun to her head. Marjorie looked at the documents spread across the sleeping platform. At the careful handwriting of a dead woman who had shared her knowledge, her tradition, her survival, who had written a note of hope and left it in a tin box for the next person who had nowhere else to go. And the man who killed her was standing outside my door 3 weeks ago. Yes, asking me for $3 a week to stay alive in the place where he killed her. Yes. Marjorie picked up Edith's death certificate and held it as carefully as she would hold a child. Edith Morrow, Redruth, 34 years old, dead on a frozen road because a 22-year-old inspector wanted to prove he could enforce the rules. She folded the document and placed it in the tin box beside Edith's note. They belong together. The words and the consequence. The hope and the cost. "We are going to make this right," Crane said. "When the time comes, Dylan will answer for what he did." The signs began 3 days later. Old Josiah Keel stood outside his shack looking at the sky with the expression of a man reading a language that most people had forgotten. "Bad one coming," he told Marjorie when she passed. "You see that color?" He pointed at the horizon, where the sky had turned a shade of yellow-gray that looked like a bruise in the first hours after impact. Heavy, swollen, wrong. Last time the sky looked like that was 47 people died that winter. Stock froze standing up in the fields. I found a man on the road to Cheyenne, frozen so solid his body did not bend when we lifted him into the wagon. Bramble felt it too. The dog had been restless for 2 days, pacing the railcar at night, refusing to settle. He stood at the door with his ears forward and his nose working the air, reading information that human senses could not detect. Twice he had whined at nothing Marjorie could see, a high, anxious sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. The birds left. Not gradually, the way birds leave when seasons change, but suddenly, in panicked flocks that burst from the trees and headed south, as if something behind them was chasing. Marjorie prepared. She gathered coal until every container she had was full. She stacked wood scraps along the interior walls. She checked every inch of insulation, stuffing burlap into gaps she had missed. She stored water inside the railcar in bottles and jars, knowing that once the temperature dropped far enough, the creek would freeze solid. And she went to town. She went to the general store where people gathered in the late afternoon. She went to the church steps where Reverend Whitley held his informal court. She went to every person she could find, and she told them what was coming. The sky is wrong. The animals are wrong. A storm is coming that will be worse than anything in 10 years. You need to prepare. You need to board your windows and stack wood and bring your animals inside. The responses came exactly as she expected. Dr. Harwell, adjusting his spectacles. Animals do not predict weather, Mrs. Colton. You are letting fear cloud your judgment. Reverend Whitley, his voice carrying the weight of a man who speaks for God. Only the Lord knows what the sky will bring. Perhaps you should spend less time reading the heavens and more time reading your Bible. Ida Crenshaw, with a smile that could cut glass. The boxcar woman is predicting the weather now. What is next? Reading tea leaves? Jasper Foley, lounging against the saloon wall, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The boxcar woman is scared of sunshine. Maybe she should go back to her tin can and let the rest of us live our lives. Laughter. The kind of laughter that follows a joke that is not funny, but is directed at someone everyone has agreed to despise. Marjorie stood in the center of it and felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise through her chest. She had survived being thrown out by her husband. She had survived hunger and cold and the slow erosion of dignity that came with picking through trash to keep her son alive. But something about standing in the middle of a town that was laughing at her while she tried to save their lives, that was a particular kind of cruelty she had not been prepared for. She tried one more time. She went to the home of old Silas Beckford, who lived alone at the north end of town in a small frame house that leaned slightly to the east, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Silas was in his 70s, hard of hearing, stubbornly independent. He opened the door and listened to her warning with the patience of a man who has heard many things in his life and found most of them unreliable. "I have survived 40 winters in this territory, girl. 40 winters. I know what cold looks like and what cold does. This is just another December. Mr. Beckford, please. The signs are all wrong. The sky, the animals, the pressure in the air. My father taught me to read these things, and he was never wrong." Silas patted her arm the way one pats a child who has woken from a nightmare. "Go home, Mrs. Colton. Keep your boy warm. Let the rest of us worry about ourselves." She walked back to the rail car in the gray afternoon light. She had done what she could. She had warned them, and they had laughed. And now whatever came next was not her failure. But it would feel like her failure. She knew that already. The storm arrived on December 23rd, 1884. It did not announce itself the way most storms do, with a gradual increase in wind, a slow thickening of snowfall, a building of pressure that gives you time to close your doors and stoke your fires. This storm arrived like something that had been running for 1,000 miles and had finally reached the thing it was chasing. The wind came first, not howling. The word howling is what people use when they have never heard a real storm. This wind shrieked. It screamed. It hit the rail car like a fist, and the metal walls rang with the impact like the inside of a bell. Marjorie felt the sound in her teeth, in the bones of her face, in the base of her skull where the body keeps its most primitive alarms. Then the snow. Not falling, driven, horizontal. White needles that found every gap, every crack, every imperfection in the rail car's armor. The air outside turned white so completely that looking through the window gaps was like looking into a wall of milk. No horizon, no ground, no sky, just white, moving, screaming white. The temperature dropped like something falling off a cliff. 20 below, 30 below. The metal walls of the rail car, which had been holding the fire's heat, began losing it faster than the flames could replace it. Frost formed on the inside surfaces. Marjorie's breath became visible even standing next to the fire. She fed the flames everything she had prepared: coal, wood, the scraps she had been saving. She followed EM's diagrams, adjusting the ventilation to maximize heat retention. The stone hearth radiated warmth upward and outward, and the insulated walls held it, and the temperature inside stabilized. 52 degrees, while outside the world was dying. Elias sat on the sleeping platform, with Bramble pressed against his side. The dog had stopped pacing. He lay with his head on his paws and his eyes fixed on the door, and the low growl that lived in his chest had gone silent, as if even Bramble understood that what was outside was beyond growling at. "Mama, when will it stop?" "I do not know, sweetheart. Soon." But it did not stop. Not that day. Not that night. Not the next morning when gray light filtered through the snow-packed gaps in the walls, and the wind had not decreased by a single degree. On the second day, Elias's cough returned. By evening, he was burning with fever. His small body shook under the blankets. His face flushed red, then went pale, then flushed again. He could not keep the broth down that Marjorie spooned into him, and every cough sounded like something tearing inside his chest. "Mama, I am cold. I am so cold." Marjorie climbed onto the platform and wrapped her body around his. She pulled Bramble closer until the three of them formed a single unit of warmth, human and animal, and desperation pressed together against the cold. She sang the songs her mother had sung when Marjorie was small and sick in their cottage in Ohio. Songs about green hills and running water and summer light that seemed as distant and impossible as the surface of the moon. She did not sleep. She held her son and listened to the storm, trying to tear the world apart, and she made bargains with God and with the universe, and with whatever force governed the space between living and dying. Take anything. Take the railcar. Take the town. Take everything I have built. Just let him live. The knocking came on the fourth day. At first, Marjorie thought it was debris hitting the railcar wall. A branch. A piece of roofing torn from some distant building and hurled across the prairie by the wind. The storm had been throwing things against the metal walls for days, and she had stopped flinching at the impacts. But this sound was different. It had a rhythm. A desperate human rhythm. She went to the door. Bramble was on his feet, not growling but alert, his ears forward, his tail low. She pushed the door open 3 inches against the force of the wind and the snow that had drifted against it. A face, white with cold, ice in the eyebrows, lips the color of slate. Ida Crenshaw. Behind her, barely visible in the swirling white, 3 smaller figures. Her husband, her 2 children. The youngest, a girl of 4, was not moving in her father's arms. Her face was the blue-white of deep cold, the color that comes just before the body stops fighting. Our house collapsed. The roof came in. We had nowhere else to go. Please. Ida's voice was stripped of everything Marjorie had ever heard in it. No judgment. No superiority, no gossip or cruelty or satisfaction at other people's suffering, just a mother holding her children in a storm that was trying to kill them. Please, Marjorie, I know I do not deserve it, but my children. Marjorie stepped back. Come in, quickly, before you freeze. They came, and then more knocking. Reverend Whitley arrived 20 minutes later, his black coat white with snow, his Bible clutched to his chest. The church windows had blown in. The sanctuary was full of snow. He could not speak when Marjorie opened the door. He simply stood there, shaking, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Come in, Reverend. Get warm. Jasper Foley came next. The young man who had thrown snowballs at her railcar, who had bet 5 cents she would crawl back to Rudolph before Christmas. He was crying. His hands were white with frostbite, the skin waxy and hard. He had tried to walk to the next town when his boarding house lost its roof, and had turned back after a mile when he realized the cold was going to kill him before he reached anything. Come in, Jasper. 2 more families. A man alone whose wife had died the previous year. A woman with an infant. The baby silent and terrifyingly still beneath the blankets. And then Ambrose Dillon. He came on the 5th day of the storm, when the wind had been screaming for over 100 hours and the temperature outside had dropped to 47 degrees below zero. He came with his wife and his daughter Phoebe, who was 5 years old and had not spoken since they left their house. Their home had collapsed. Their fireplace had failed. They had burned furniture, then books, then clothing. And still the cold came. He stood in the doorway of the railcar, ice in his thin mustache, his wife behind him holding Phoebe against her chest. The girl's face was gray. Her eyes were open, but they were not seeing anything. Dylan's eyes met Marjorie's, and in them she saw something she had not expected. Not arrogance, not the bureaucratic satisfaction she had seen 3 weeks ago when he gave her 48 hours to leave. What she saw was the weight of 13 years, the weight of a frozen road and a woman's body that did not bend when they lifted it. "I know," he said. His voice was barely audible above the wind. "I know I do not have the right to ask." Marjorie looked at him. She looked at his wife, whose eyes were wild with fear. She looked at Phoebe, 5 years old, silent, her small body limp against her mother's shoulder. She thought about Edith Morrow, about the note in the tin box, about the death certificate folded beside it, about a woman who had survived a winter in this exact space and then been sent to die by the man now standing in the door. And she thought about what Edith would want. Not justice, not revenge, not the satisfaction of watching the man who killed her stand in the cold the way she had stood in the cold 13 years ago. Edith had written a note of hope. She had left diagrams to help whoever came next. She had used her last act in this railcar to reach forward across time and say, "You can survive this." Edith Morrow had been a woman who opened doors. "Come in," Marjorie said. "Get warm." Dylan's wife sobbed. She pushed past her husband with Phoebe and went straight to the fire. Dylan remained in the doorway for a moment longer, his face working through something that had no name. "Thank you," he whispered. Marjorie said nothing. She closed the door against the wind and turned to face the railcar full of people. 14. 14 souls packed into a space 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. 14 people who had laughed at her, gossiped about her, bet on her failure, threatened to take her home and her son. 14 people whose lives now depended on the walls she had insulated with her own hands, on the fire pit she had built from creek stones and a dead woman's diagrams, on the knowledge her father had carried from Cornwall to Ohio, to the workshop behind a house that no longer existed. Elias was sitting up on the sleeping platform, his fever-bright eyes wide. He looked at all the people crowded into their home, at the children crying and the adults shaking, at Bramble pressing himself against the wall to make room. "Mama," he said, "who are all these people?" "Our neighbors, sweetheart. But they were mean to us." "Yes, they were. But when people need help, we help them. That is who we are. 14 people, 14 lives. And outside, the storm that would kill 19 people across the county screamed against the walls of a rail car that a woman had built from nothing because she had nowhere else to go. Marjorie looked at the tin box on the shelf where she kept it. Inside, Edith's note, Edith's death certificate, Edith's diagrams that had taught her how to make these walls hold heat. "The earth never lies," she whispered. "And neither did you, Edith. Neither did you. 14 people in a space built for freight. The rail car had never been meant for this. It had been built to carry grain or lumber or mining equipment across the Wyoming plains, and now it held 14 human beings and a dog, all of them pressed together in the orange light of a fire that Marjorie fed with the discipline of a woman who understood that flame was the only thing standing between life and something permanent. She organized them without raising her voice. She did not ask for authority. She simply began making decisions, and people who had spent weeks mocking her followed those decisions without question. Because the storm had stripped away everything except the basic animal need to survive. And survival was the one thing Marjorie Colton understood better than anyone in that room. The sleeping platform went to the children and the injured. Elias moved to the floor without being asked, making room for Phoebe Dillon and Ida's 4-year-old daughter and the infant whose mother had not stopped shaking since she arrived. Bramble positioned himself at the edge of the platform, a warm barrier between the children and the cold floor, his body heat supplementing what the fire could provide. The adults arranged themselves along the walls in groups determined not by friendship or social standing, but by body heat. The largest men on the outside, closest to the metal walls. The women in the middle. The elderly nearest the fire. Josiah Keel, who had arrived on the second day of knocking with nothing but his walking stick and a calm expression, took the spot farthest from the flames and gave his blanket to the woman with the infant. "I have survived worse," he said when Marjorie tried to give it back. "Save your kindness for someone who needs it." Food was rationed with merciless precision. Marjorie counted everything. The dried rabbit meat, the bread from Helga's last delivery before the storm, the bone broth she had stored in sealed jars, the small reserve of flour she had traded sewing work for in the weeks before. She divided it into portions that would keep 14 people alive for 7 days if the storm lasted that long. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But no one complained. Hunger had a different quality when shared. It became something communal, almost bearable, a discomfort distributed across 14 bodies instead of crushing a single one. Jasper Foley nearly lost his hands on the third night. Marjorie had been watching him since he arrived. His fingers had gone from white to gray, and now, on the third night inside the railcar, they were developing the dark, mottled look of frostbite that had progressed past the surface. He held them against his chest and said nothing, because young men like Jasper had been taught that pain was something you kept to yourself. Marjorie noticed because she had been taught differently. "Let me see your hands," she said. He resisted. She did not ask again. She took his wrists and turned his palms upward, and the railcar went quiet as people saw what the cold had done. The skin on 3 fingers of his right hand had turned a deep purplish gray. The tissue beneath was hard, wooden almost. The blood retreated so far from the surface that the fingers looked like they belonged to a man who had been dead for hours. Jasper's face went white, not from pain, but from understanding. "Am I going to lose them?" Marjorie did not answer immediately. She had seen frostbite before. Her father had come home from the mines with frozen hands more than once, and her mother had treated them with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that warmth, applied incorrectly, could cause more damage than the cold itself. She heated water on the stone hearth. Not hot. Warm. The temperature of a bath you would give an infant, comfortable against the inside of your wrist. She tested it 3 times before she was satisfied. "This is going to hurt," she said. Jasper looked at her with eyes that were suddenly very young. 20 years old, and all the bravado, all the swagger, all the snowball-throwing confidence had been stripped away to reveal what was underneath. A boy. who was frightened. Marjorie lowered his hands into the water. He did not scream. She gave him that. His jaw locked, his eyes closed. The muscles in his neck stood out like ropes. A sound came from somewhere deep in his throat, not a scream, but the place where a scream begins before pride catches it. The process took 40 minutes. Marjorie changed the water twice, keeping it warm but never hot, because hot water on frozen tissue was the same as throwing ice on a burn. The damage happened at the boundary between temperatures. Slow was safe. Gradual was survival. Color returned to his fingers in stages. Gray to white. White to pink. Pink to an angry red that meant blood was flowing again, which meant the tissue was alive, which meant Jasper Foley would keep his hands. He looked at his fingers, flexing them slowly, watching them move. Then he looked at Marjorie. "I bet 5 cents you would be dead by Christmas," he said. His voice cracked. "I threw snowballs at your home. I laughed when people called it Colton's folly." Marjorie dried his hands with a strip of clean cloth. "The past is the past, Jasper." "No." He shook his head. "No, it is not. I need to say this. You just saved my hands. You saved my life. And a month ago, I was standing in the snow, making bets about when you would die. What kind of person does that?" "A young one," Marjorie said quietly. "A young one who has not yet learned what matters." She wrapped his hands in clean bandages, torn from one of her flour sack curtains. Jasper sat staring at his wrapped fingers for a long time, and when Elias came to sit beside him with Bramble trailing behind, the young man looked at the boy with an expression that contained something new. "Your ma is amazing," Jasper said, "and you should be proud of her." Elias nodded seriously. "I know." Phoebe Dillon had not spoken since arriving at the railcar. The 5-year-old sat wherever her mother placed her, ate what was put in her mouth, and stared at the wall with eyes that were open but unoccupied. The cold had done something to her that went beyond the physical. The collapse of their house, the hours in the storm, the sight of her father on his knees in the doorway of a woman he had threatened. Something in the chain of those experiences had severed the connection between Phoebe and the world around her. Her mother tried everything. She held her. She sang to her. She whispered her name over and over like an incantation. She pressed her face against her daughter's hair and begged her to say something, anything, even just her name. Phoebe stared at the wall and said nothing. On the 4th day inside the railcar, Bramble did what no human had been able to do. The dog had been making his rounds the way he always did, checking on each person in the railcar with the quiet diligence of a creature who took his responsibilities seriously. He pressed his nose against sleeping children to make sure they were breathing. He lay beside the elderly when they shivered. He positioned himself between the door and the rest of the space whenever the wind shifted, as if his body could hold back the storm. He reached Phoebe on his 3rd circuit of the morning. The girl was sitting in her usual spot against the wall, her mother beside her, both of them silent. Bramble stopped. He looked at Phoebe for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done with anyone else. He lay down directly in front of her, placed his head on her lap, and let out a long, slow breath. The sound of it filled the railcar. That particular sigh a dog makes when it has found the exact place it needs to be. The sound of an animal settling into purpose. Phoebe did not react at first. Her eyes remained fixed on the wall. Her hands lay at her sides, motionless. Bramble did not move. He simply breathed, his warm weight on her small legs, his torn ear twitching occasionally, his eyes half closed with the patience of a creature that understood something about silence that humans had forgotten. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then Phoebe's right hand moved, slowly, as if the muscles had forgotten how to respond to commands. Her fingers touched Bramble's fur, rested there, felt the warmth beneath the golden coat, the steady rise and fall of breathing, the evidence of something alive and present and unconditionally kind. Her fingers curled into the fur. She gripped it the way a drowning person grips a rope, and something behind her eyes shifted like a lamp being lit in a room that had been dark. "Can I keep petting the dog?" Her voice was small and rough from days of silence, but it was there. It was real. And every adult in the railcar heard it. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. She pressed her hand over her mouth and tears ran down her face and she could not speak. Ambrose Dillon, sitting 3 feet away, covered his eyes with both hands. His shoulders shook. "Of course you can," Marjorie said softly. "His name is Bramble. He likes it when you scratch behind his ears." Phoebe's other hand came up. Both hands now buried in Bramble's fur, and the dog's tail thumped against the wooden floor, and the girl's face changed. Not a smile. Something before a smile. The place where smiles begin. Around the railcar, people wiped their eyes and pretended they were not crying. Josiah Keel blew his nose loudly. Helga Lindgren turned to the fire and busied herself with a pot that did not need stirring. Reverend Whitley bowed his head and for the first time in Marjorie's memory appeared to be praying for someone other than himself. Night fell on the 4th day, and the storm showed no sign of ending. The wind had settled into a constant scream, almost rhythmic, a sound that had become so familiar it was nearly possible to forget it was there. Nearly. Marjorie sat beside the fire, feeding it measured portions of coal, calculating how many hours of fuel remained. Elias slept on the floor with his head on a folded blanket, his fever holding steady, but not rising. Bramble had returned to his position beside Phoebe, who had fallen asleep with one hand still gripping his fur. Ida Crenshaw sat across the fire from Marjorie. The gossip woman had been quiet since arriving, quieter than Marjorie had ever known her. The sharp edges had been worn smooth by fear and gratitude, and the slow humiliation of sitting in a home she had mocked, alive because of a woman she had slandered. She spoke now in a voice so low that only Marjorie could hear. "I was jealous of you." Ida stared at the fire. "Every day since you came to this town, you had education. You read books. You spoke in ways that made me feel small even when you were not trying to. And Rudolph, he was a brute and everyone knew it, but you bore it with such dignity that it made the rest of us look at our own marriages and wonder what we were enduring and why." She paused. The fire crackled. Wind screamed outside. "So when he threw you out, when the story came that you had been unfaithful, I was glad. God forgive me, but I was glad. Because it meant you were not better than me after all. It meant you were just as broken and just as fallen as the rest of us. And I needed that to be true. I needed it more than I needed the truth." She looked at Marjorie. The firelight carved deep shadows in her face. "I was wrong about everything, and I am sorry." I am so deeply sorry. Marjorie was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. The wind blew. 14 people breathed in the orange light. I know what it costs to say that, Ida. Thank you. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. A door opened a crack instead of being slammed shut. Whitfield Crane, who had arrived on the second day carrying nothing but his leather satchel, caught Marjorie's arm as she passed him on the way to check the fire. I brought everything, he said quietly. The deed of abandonment, Dylan's original report, Edith's death certificate, the mail carrier's testimony. When this storm ends, Marjorie, you will own this land, legally, permanently, and Rudolph will never take Elias. I have enough to bury his custody claim 10 times over. Marjorie looked at the old lawyer, at his wild white hair and his battered satchel, and the fierce conviction in his 70-year-old eyes. Even in the middle of a storm, she said, you are still fighting. Crane almost smiled. Especially in the middle of a storm. That is when it matters most. Dylan's confession came later that same night, when most of the railcar was asleep and the fire had burned down to embers that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. He sat near the door where he had positioned himself since arriving, as far from the fire as possible, as if he did not believe he deserved its warmth. His wife and Phoebe slept together against the wall, the girl's hand still resting on Bramble's back. Marjorie was awake. She was always awake now. Sleep had become a luxury she could not afford with 14 lives depending on a fire that needed constant attention. Dylan spoke without looking at her. Her name was Edith Morrow. I know, Marjorie said. He nodded slowly. I was a company man with 15 years of following orders. I had been told to clear unauthorized occupants from company property. She was the one I could not forget. She was the first one. She was living in this rail car, in this exact space, and I told her she had 24 hours to leave. His voice was flat, rehearsed. The voice of a man who had told himself this story 1,000 times in the dark. She begged me. She told me she had nowhere to go. She showed me what she had built. The insulation, the fire pit. Exactly what you have built. And I told her it was company property, and the law was the law. I was 22, and I believed that following orders was the same thing as being right. He stopped. The embers pulse. She died 3 days later on the road to Rock Springs. They found her frozen in a ditch. I read the report. I read the description of how they found her. And I have carried it for 13 years. Every day, every night, every time I close my eyes, I see her standing in the doorway of this rail car with her bag in her hand, looking at me like I was the last person she would ever look at. And I was. The rail car was silent except for the breathing of sleeping people and the distant screaming of the wind. I tried to make it go away. I changed the report. I told the railroad she left voluntarily. I buried the evidence. But you cannot bury a thing like that. It lives in you. It becomes part of your architecture, part of the way your bones are arranged. I have been carrying a dead woman inside my chest for 13 years, and I cannot put her down. Marjorie said nothing for a long time. She watched the embers. Edith wrote a note. she finally said. Before she left, she put it in a tin box under the floorboards with a few coins and a spool of thread. The note said that this railcar kept her alive and it could keep the next person alive too. She said, "You are stronger than you know." Dylan made a sound, not a word, something deeper than words. She was still trying to help people, Marjorie continued. Even when she was about to lose everything, even when you were taking her home away, she was thinking about whoever would come next. The embers glowed, faded, glowed again. That is who she was, Marjorie said. And I think she would want you to stop carrying her. I think she would want you to put her down and do something useful with the years you have left. It was not forgiveness. Marjorie did not know if she could forgive him, maybe not ever, but it was something. A direction to face instead of a wall to stand against. Dylan nodded. He wiped his face with both hands, and then he was quiet, and the night continued, and the storm continued, and the embers continued their slow pulse in the darkness. Hugh McAllister found Marjorie by the fire when the rest of the railcar slept. He had arrived on the first day with 2 families he had found struggling through the snow near his forge. He had not spoken to Marjorie directly since then. Too many people, too little space, too much that needed to be done before there was room for anything personal. But now, in the deep hours of the 5th night, with the wind settling from a scream to something that was almost a moan, he sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. Then his hand found hers, rough fingers, calloused from the forge, warm. "I should not have stayed away," he said. "Rudolph came to the forge. He told me he would burn it down if I came to the railcar again. And I let that stop me. I let a bully's threat keep me from the place I wanted to be." Marjorie looked at their hands together in the firelight, his broad and scarred from years of metalwork, hers red and rough from weeks of survival. "You are here now," she said. "I watched you build a home from nothing. I watched you feed people who were starving and warm people who were freezing and save a man's hands and bring a child back to life with a dog. And I stood in my forge and told myself I was being practical. But practical is just another word for afraid." "You are here now," Marjorie said again. "That is what matters." He squeezed her hand. She let him. On the sleeping platform, Elias lay with his eyes closed and a small, quiet smile on his face. He had been awake for all of it. Before dawn on the 7th day, Elias's fever broke. Marjorie felt it happen. The heat that had been radiating from his small body for days suddenly eased like a fire banking itself. His breathing changed, deepening, slowing, becoming the breathing of a child, asleep instead of a child fighting. His face, which had been flushed and tight with illness, relaxed into something peaceful. His eyes opened, clear, present, seeing her. "Mama, I had bad dreams." She pulled him close, pressed her face into his hair, held him so tightly that Bramble whined and tried to push his way between them, unwilling to be left out of something that clearly mattered. "I know, sweetheart, but you are awake now. The dreams are over." He looked around the rail car at the sleeping bodies, at the fire burning low, at Bramble wagging his tail. "Are they all going to be okay?" "Yes, Elias. I think they are." He nodded. Then he put his head against her shoulder and closed his eyes. And within 30 seconds, he was asleep again. Real sleep this time. The deep, boneless sleep of a child whose body had decided to live. Outside, the wind had dropped. Not completely, but enough. The screaming had stopped. The railcar walls had stopped trembling. The storm was not over, but it was exhausted, and the world outside was growing quiet, the way a battlefield grows quiet when the fighting finally stops. Marjorie sat holding her son and listening to the silence. 14 people, 1 railcar, 7 days, and in the tin box on the shelf, 2 documents lay side by side. A note of hope, written by a dead woman, and a death certificate signed by the man sleeping 3 feet from the door. "The earth never lies," Marjorie whispered, and the storm breathed its last breath against the walls and was done. When Marjorie pushed open the railcar door on the morning of the 8th day, the world outside was unrecognizable. Snow stood 5 feet deep in drifts that reached the roof of the railcar on the windward side. The railroad yard had been erased. Tracks, equipment, fences, all buried beneath a white that was so complete it looked less like snow and more like the earth had simply decided to start over. The silence was enormous. After 7 days of screaming wind, the absence of sound was almost painful. A pressure against the eardrums that made people wince and shake their heads as if trying to clear water from their ears. The sky was blue. Perfectly, mercilessly blue. The kind of blue that comes after violence. Clean and cold and indifferent to what it looks down upon. 14 people filed out of the railcar, one by one, blinking in the sunlight, shielding their eyes against the glare. They stood in the snow and looked at what the storm had done to the town they thought they knew. Roofs collapsed. Walls bowed inward. The church steeple tilted at an angle that said it would not survive the next wind. The general store had lost its front wall entirely, its shelves exposed to the open air like the insides of a broken clock. They learned the full extent over the following days, as roads were cleared and riders came through with news from the surrounding county. 19 dead, hundreds of cattle frozen in the fields, standing upright where the cold had caught them, their legs locked beneath them like terrible statues. The railroad line buried under drifts that would take weeks to clear. Homesteads collapsed, families missing. And at the north end of town, in a small frame house that leaned slightly to the east, Silas Beckford sat in his chair by the cold fireplace. He had been dead for at least 4 days. The fire had gone out sometime on the 2nd night, and the old man who had survived 40 winters in Wyoming territory had not survived the 41st. His face was calm. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked like a man who had fallen asleep and simply never returned from wherever sleep had taken him. Marjorie stood in his doorway and looked at him for a long time. She had knocked on this door. She had stood on this porch and told him what was coming. She had begged him to prepare, to come to the railcar, to let her help, and he had patted her arm and told her to go home. He did not have to die, she said to no one. None of them had to die. She closed his door gently and walked back through the snow to the railcar. And the weight of Silas Beckford's empty chair stayed with her for the rest of her life. Not as guilt. She had done what she could, but as evidence that the world does not always allow you to save everyone, and that the spaces where you fail matter as much as the spaces where you succeed. The reckoning came slowly, the way dawn comes in winter. Not all at once, but in degrees. Ida Crenshaw was first. She came to Marjorie on the second morning after the storm, standing straight with her hands clasped in front of her in the posture of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say and is determined to get through it without breaking down. I spread lies about you. I called your home a folly. I told people you were a fallen woman because it made me feel righteous, and it made my own life seem less small. She paused. You opened your door to me when I had given you every reason to leave it shut. I will never be able to repay that, but I will spend the rest of my life trying. Reverend Whitley came next. He stood in front of Marjorie with his Bible in his hands, and for the first time she noticed that the book was trembling. I preached about charity and compassion from my pulpit every Sunday for 20 years, and you showed me what those words actually mean. I have a sermon to write about the lessons of this storm, and you, Mrs. Colton, will be at the center of it, not as an example of sin, as an example of grace. Jasper Foley found Elias outside the railcar where the boy was throwing sticks for Bramble. The young man stood at a distance, his bandaged hands held awkwardly at his sides, unable to meet the boy's eyes. I was a bully and a fool, Jasper said. Your ma saved my hands. She saved my life. And I want you to know that I am ashamed of every snowball I ever threw at this place. You should be proud of her. She is the best person I have ever known. Elias regarded him with the serious expression of a child who has learned to evaluate adults by what they do rather than what they say. Then he nodded once. She knows, Elias said, and you should tell her, not me. Ambrose Dillon came with documents. He stood before Marjorie in the weak morning sunlight, his wife and Phoebe behind him. The girl was holding her mother's hand, and in her other arm she clutched a scrap of blanket that Bramble had slept on, pressed against her cheek. She had not let go of it since leaving the railcar. Dillon held out a folded paper. This is the deed of abandonment for this section of track. The railroad officially released this property in 1878. It has been unclaimed land for 6 years. By rights of continuous habitation, you have a legal claim to this railcar and the land beneath it. I will personally ensure the paperwork is filed, and I will personally ensure that no one from the railroad troubles you again. He paused. His jaw worked. And I will personally ensure that the truth about Edith Morrow is entered into the record. What I did. What the railroad covered up. All of it. I cannot give her back her life, but I can give her back her name. Marjorie took the deed. The paper was heavy in her hands. Legal language, official stamps. The machinery of ownership that she had never been permitted to operate before. What will happen to you? She asked. Dillon's mouth thinned. I have resigned my position. I suspect the railroad will want the matter handled quietly. I suspect there will be a settlement for Edith's surviving relatives, if any can be found. And I suspect I will spend whatever years I have left trying to become the kind of man who deserves to have been saved by you. He looked at her. Marjorie saw the 13 years in his eyes, the frozen road, the body that did not bend. Edith would want you to live better, she said. Not just feel guilty. There is a difference. He nodded. He turned and walked away with his family. Phoebe still clutching the blanket that smelled like Bramble, and Marjorie watched them go and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. but the possibility of forgiveness, which is the field in which forgiveness eventually grows. Rudolph came last. He appeared a week after the storm, when the roads had been cleared enough for travel and the story of the railcar had spread across the territory. He stood at the edge of the railroad yard, looking at the railcar that had become famous, at the woman who had become a symbol of everything he had tried to destroy. He looked smaller. The swagger was gone. In its place was something that resembled recognition, the dim awareness of a man confronting the shape of his own failure. Judge Harrison says there is no point pursuing custody. He said any court in the territory would rule in your favor now. Marjorie felt something release in her chest. A band of iron she had been carrying for weeks finally loosened. Good. I heard about a gold strike in Colorado. I am thinking of heading out that way. Then go. He looked at her. For one moment, something passed across his face that might have been understanding. A flicker of comprehension of what he had thrown away, of the woman he had never bothered to see clearly, of the son he had called weak who had survived a storm that killed 19 people. Then it was gone. Because Rudolph Colton was not a man built for understanding. He was built for forward motion, for the next drink, the next strike, the next reason to be angry at a world that had never given him what he believed he deserved. He turned and walked away. Marjorie watched until he disappeared around the corner of a distant building. She felt no satisfaction, no vindication, no triumph. Only the quiet relief of watching a storm finally pass beyond the horizon, knowing it would not return. She never saw him again. Whitfield Crane filed the paperwork in January. By March, Marjorie held in her hands a deed of ownership for the railcar and the quarter-acre of Wyoming territory it occupied. She hung it on the wall beside the cracked mirror and Edith Morrow's note. Elias traced the words with his finger, sounding out the legal language until he found their names. Marjorie and Elias Colton. That is us, Mama. That is really us. Yes, sweetheart. That is really us. Hugh McAllister proposed on a spring evening when the snow had finally melted and green shoots were pushing through the mud around the railcar. He did not kneel. He stood in the doorway of the forge where he had spent his life shaping iron into useful things, and he held out a ring he had made himself. Simple, strong, forged from a railroad spike he had pulled from the abandoned track near the railcar. I am not good with words, he said, but I am good with my hands. And I would like to spend the rest of my life building things beside you. Marjorie looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at Elias standing behind him in the doorway of the forge with Bramble at his side, and an expression on his face that said he had been expecting this for some time. She looked at her son. Well, Elias considered the matter with the gravity it deserved. Then he nodded. Grandpa would approve. They married in the rail car on a Sunday in April, with Josiah Keel as witness and Helga Lindgren providing a wedding supper of Swedish meatballs and rye bread that people talked about for years afterward. Bramble sat beside Elias throughout the ceremony and thumped his tail against the wooden floor at the moment Marjorie said yes. The years unfolded the way seasons unfold, slowly, and then all at once. Other women found their way to Marjorie's door. Women fleeing violence. Women cast out. Women with children and nothing else. She could not take them all in, but she could teach them. She could show them how to insulate walls and build fire pits and set snares and survive. She could point them toward Crane, when they needed the law, and toward Helga when they needed to eat, and toward Hugh when they needed something built or repaired. The area around the railcar grew. One cabin, built by a woman named Sarah, who had learned by watching Marjorie, then another, then another. The railroad, embarrassed by the scandal of Edith Morrow's death and eager to avoid further attention, donated several abandoned railcars. By 1890, 15 women and their children lived in the community that had formed around Marjorie's original home. They called it Haven's Rest. No one remembered who first used the name. Helga Lindgren retired from the hotel and opened a small restaurant there. Josiah Keel spent his final years teaching the children skills he had learned in 40 years on the railroad. He died in the winter of 1891, peacefully, in a chair beside the fire in Marjorie's railcar, which was where he said he wanted to be at the end. Elias grew up. He finished his education, traveled east to study law, and returned to Wyoming to practice. He specialized in cases involving women and children. He married a woman he met in law school and built a house on the lot beside his mother's railcar. His first case was a custody dispute on behalf of a woman whose husband had thrown her out. He won. Bramble grew old the way good dogs grow old, slowly and with dignity. His golden fur turned white around the muzzle. His steps shortened. His torn ear, which had always given him a rakish look, drooped lower as the cartilage softened with age. He spent his last years sleeping in the sun on the porch Hugh had built onto the railcar, occasionally lifting his head to watch children play in the yard, his tail giving a slow, contented wag when one of them stopped to scratch behind his ears. He died in the spring of 1897, peacefully, in his sleep, with Elias's hand on his head and Marjorie's hand on his back, and the sun coming through the window of the rail car where he had spent 13 years guarding the family that had found him in the brambles. They buried him beside the rail car under a stone that Hugh had carved. Bramble. He found us when we needed finding. Good boy. Elias, who was 21 years old and had just passed the bar exam and had not cried since he was 8 years old, standing in the snow outside his father's house, wept without shame. Marjorie held her grown son the way she had held him that first night in the rail car, and Bramble's grave became a place where flowers grew every spring without anyone planting them. On a September evening in 1905, Marjorie sat on the porch of the rail car and watched the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in colors she had never learned the names for. She was 63 years old. Her hair had gone silver. Her hands, rough and scarred from decades of work, rested in her lap with the stillness of hands that had done everything they needed to do. Elias sat beside her. A grown man now with gray at his temples and a law practice that had changed the lives of more women than he could count. His daughter, 7 years old, played in the yard with a golden dog that was Bramble's great-granddaughter in spirit, if not in blood. The child came running to the porch, breathless with the urgency that only 7-year-olds possess. "Grandma, did you really live in this rail car? Was it not scary?" Marjorie smiled. Her granddaughter had her eyes, and Elias's chin, and something around the mouth that reminded her of her own father, the Cornish miner who had taught her that stone holds heat. "I was terrified," she said. "I did not know if we would survive. Every night I lay awake wondering if I had made the wrong choice. I made promises to your father that I had no way of keeping." She reached out and touched the girl's hair. "I made those promises because he needed to hear them, because hope was all I had to give. And then I woke up every morning and chose to keep those promises. One day at a time. One choice at a time, until the days became weeks, and the weeks became years, and the promises became true. The girl considered this. Will you teach me what great-grandpa taught you? About the stones and the fire and the earth? Marjorie pulled her granddaughter onto her lap and held her close. The railcar stood behind them, repainted several times, but still solid, still standing, still holding heat the way Cornish stone holds heat, stubbornly and faithfully and without complaint. Yes, my darling, I will teach you everything. The railcar stands today. It has been preserved by the Wyoming Historical Society as a monument to frontier survival and the resilience of women who built lives from nothing when nothing was all the world would give them. In 1927, a team of engineers visited the site and measured the interior temperature during a January cold snap. The railcar maintained a stable temperature 17 degrees warmer than the surrounding structures, exactly consistent with the Cornish mining insulation techniques described in the diagrams found beneath the floorboards. A plaque beside the door tells part of the story. It mentions the storm of 1884 and the 14 lives saved. It mentions Haven's Rest and the community that grew there. It mentions Marjorie Colton's legacy as a builder, a teacher, a survivor. But a plaque cannot hold everything. It cannot hold the sound of an 8-year-old boy saying for my lessons while holding a broken piece of slate. It cannot hold the weight of a tin cup of broth fed to a dying child in the dark. It cannot hold the feeling of a dog's head settling into a silent girl's lap, or the sound of a voice returning after days of absence. It cannot hold the moment a woman stood at an open door in the middle of the night with her hand on the metal and her foot on the threshold and chose to turn back. Inside the railcar, in a glass case mounted on the wall, 2 documents sit side by side. A note written in careful handwriting on yellowed paper. You are stronger than you know. Signed E.M. 1871, and beside it, a second note in different handwriting, added 14 years later. Edith, you saved us. Your railcar kept us alive, just as it kept you alive. I will make sure no one forgets. The earth never lies. Marjorie, 1885. 2 women, 2 winters, 1 railcar. The earth never lies. And neither did they. If you are facing your own storm right now, whatever shape it takes, whatever name it carries, remember Marjorie Colton. Remember that she started with nothing but an empty railcar and 3 matches and the memory of her father's hands. Remember that the skills you need are already inside you, passed down from the people who loved you, waiting for the moment you need them most. Remember that home is not what others give you. Home is what you build with your own hands when the world tells you that you deserve nothing. And remember, always, that you are stronger than you know. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories to tell. Stories of women who refused to break. Stories of hands that kept building when everything said stop. The earth never lies, and neither will we.